This is Central America, and this is the Panama Canal, one of the most important elements in global trade. And right now, it's getting a serious competitor in a pretty unexpected place. Let's take a look over here. This is the Indian Ocean, and here in the Andaman Sea lies the Nicobar Islands archipelago. On one of those islands, India is developing a $10 billion mega project. Let's zoom in and see what's happening there. 1 billion cubic feet of earth. That's how much material will be dredged up from the seabed in total to create new land. At the same time, India is working to build an entire city on the island, with a population of 650,000 people, along with a massive airport designed specifically to serve it. That's a lot of investment for an isolated remote island, which is exactly why today we're going to break down what's really happening there and why India is doing all this in the first place. And of course, what China and the Panama Canal have to do with it. So why did India suddenly need infrastructure on such a huge scale? Strange as it may sound, the decision to start developing these islands was actually driven by a completely different country, China. In India's view, Beijing is effectively surrounding the country and creating a full-scale strategic threat. Just look at Pakistan. It's a neighboring country with which India has had a long, bitter history of conflict and constant confrontations. Then, at a certain point, China started investing there on a huge scale. That's how the CPEC Corridor project emerged. And by early 2026, around $65 billion had already been poured into it. The money's gone into roads, railways, and energy infrastructure. All of these links China to the Arabian Sea, giving Beijing a way to ship goods while bypassing some of the world's major trade choke points. And the key point here is the Gwadar port. The port's recently undergone a major expansion. Terminals for massive vessels, storage facilities, and processing infrastructure. Control is in the hands of Chinese companies. That means Beijing now oversees cargo flows right on India's doorstep. One port and one corridor. This may not seem like a Chinese threat looming over India, but China's expansion doesn't stop there. Further south, very close to India's shores, is Sri Lanka. You might think this is exactly the kind of place that should be firmly within Delhi's sphere of influence, but that's not the case. Chinese influence has reached here too. There's the port of Hambantota, which has effectively become Chinese. It was leased to China for 99 years. Officially, this happened because of debt. In reality, it means a strategic asset is now under Beijing's control. And it's not just the port itself, but also large surrounding areas where industrial zones are being developed. And all of this is happening right next to India. But even then, maybe it still doesn't seem all that serious, does it? Okay, how about Colombo, Sri Lanka's largest city? There, a massive project called Port City is rising on reclaimed land. A new financial hub built, once again, with Chinese money. At first glance, it looks like a standard investment project, but from India's perspective, it's one more Chinese foothold right on its doorstep. Naturally, this makes New Delhi uneasy. But one might think India's eastern flank is still relatively free from Chinese influence, right? Well, not quite, because Myanmar's part of the picture too. In Myanmar, China's been developing the deepwater port of Chakpyu. This is a multi-billion-dollar investment project with oil and gas terminals as well as pipelines stretching straight into China's Yunnan province. And there's another country to India's west, Bangladesh. China has made major inroads there as well. Beijing has committed more than $24 billion to modernizing the port of Chittagong and building other infrastructure. At this point, the situation already looks far less reassuring, and it doesn't end there. Even the Maldives, that tourist paradise not far from India, have not remained outside China's reach. Chinese companies are heavily involved in airports, bridges, and transport links between the islands. Now, the whole situation really does start to resemble a kind of encirclement of India. But what worries New Delhi even more is something else entirely. In India's view, any infrastructure like this, a port, an airport, an industrial zone, can, at the right moment, gain military value. Today, it's containers and tourists. Tomorrow, it could be something far less peaceful. So where does this suspicion come from? Why is India so convinced this is about more than economics? New Delhi believes it has good reason. The most sensitive example is the Coco Islands off the coast of Myanmar. Satellite imagery from early 2026 shows that on Great Coco Island, a large hangar has been completed and radar facilities have been significantly upgraded. At this point, the scale no longer looks accidental. In practice, Beijing appears to be using these facilities through its arrangements with Myanmar's military authorities. That effectively gives China the ability to monitor waters where India conducts some of its most important naval exercises. and the monitoring could be extensive. Indian fleet movements can be tracked by radar before the ships even reach the open sea. So yes, from India's point of view, China really is surrounding the country, pushing into the region's trade routes and creating the potential for military pressure. That's why India decided it needs a mega project of its own on the Nicobar Islands. But how exactly could that help in this situation? Let's look right here. The Strait of Malacca lies very close by, one of the most important routes in global trade and a vital choke point for China. What makes this so important? Let's take a step back. Asia is home to some of the world's biggest manufacturing economies, producing everything imaginable. And much of that cargo has to reach Europe by sea. How do you do that? The answer is the Strait of Malacca. Every year, more than 90,000 ships pass through this narrow corridor, carrying roughly a quarter of all global seaborne trade. Any disruption to navigation at this choke point can immediately throw global supply chains into chaos and send prices surging worldwide. But for Beijing, the strait matters for more than just container traffic. It's also the route for about 80% of China's crude oil imports, along with a major share of its liquefied natural gas supplies from the Persian Gulf and Africa. Can you imagine just how dependent China is on this passage? When it comes to China, oil's part of the bigger story. And right at the gateway to this critical waterway, India has decided to build its own version of Singapore, a massive strategic hub worth about $10 billion, one that could eventually rival even the Panama Canal in importance. The whole venture is called the Great Nicobar Island Development Project. As the name suggests, it's centered on Great Nicobar Island, right here. So what exactly is India planning to build? The first and most important piece is the deepwater Galathea port, with a price tag of more than $5 billion. And the key to making it possible is dredging, because without it, the port simply can't function. The plan is to excavate around 1 billion cubic feet of material, a huge amount. The main focus is on creating an approach channel about 1,300 feet wide. Essentially, they're carving it out almost from scratch, turning it into a smooth, straight corridor for massive container ships. At the same time, they're cutting out a turning basin roughly 2,600 feet across. The depth there has to be uniform throughout. No sudden changes, no surprises. For a ship, the real danger is not where the water is deeper, but where it's shallower. Even if the overall depth is sufficient, any high spots on the seabed still have to be removed. In the end, India wants Galathea to have a depth of a little over 65 feet, enough to handle some of the largest vessels in global trade. That raises an obvious question. Where will all that dredged material go? We're talking about 1 billion cubic feet, not a few truckloads. India's answer is straightforward and practical. A large portion of it will be used to build the megaport, specifically by creating new land. The project calls for reclaiming nearly 1.2 square miles of territory right in the bay. Terminals, warehouses, and heavy equipment will all stand on land that doesn't exist today. Even now, this makes India look like a much more serious player in global trade. But the project doesn't stop there. Galathea Port will be built on both reclaimed land and existing shoreline. At its core will be 2 large container terminals. They'll be developed in 4 stages. The first phase will include about 2,600 feet of quay wall, enough to handle 2 giant container ships at the same time. Over time, the port will expand significantly. The total length of container berths will eventually reach about 1.4 miles. Altogether, that means around a dozen specialized berthing positions, each serving a specific purpose. There's also a separate fuel handling component. The plan calls for 2 deepwater berths for liquid cargo. They'll be connected to storage tanks for oil and liquefied natural gas. In other words, the port will not just receive cargo, it'll also be able to refuel ships passing through. The terminals will be equipped with super post-Panamax cranes. These are enormous machines with ultra-long booms, designed to work vessels carrying containers stacked more than 20 rows wide across the deck. It all sounds ambitious, but when will Galathea actually be finished? The port is ultimately expected to handle 16 million containers a year, but that is still a long way off. India says it won't happen until sometime after 2040, while some sources push the date even further, into 2050 to 2058. Still, no one will have to wait that long to see the first results. The initial phase, with a capacity of 4 million containers a year, is supposed to launch as early as 2028. And once that happens, India's position could start changing dramatically. Remember I said Galathea could emerge as a rival to the Panama Canal? That's where it gets really interesting. Look, the Panama Canal, with all of its infrastructure, is built around Neo-Panamax-class ships. That means vessels up to about 1,200 feet long, around 160 feet wide, and with a draft of up to roughly 49 feet. In terms of capacity, that's about 13,000 to 15,000 containers. Larger ships run into limitations, and in some cases, they can't pass through at all. Now compare that to Galathea. It's being designed for a completely different scale from the start. It's expected to handle ships up to about 1,310 feet long, nearly 200 feet wide, with a draft of around 52 to 56 feet. Capacity could reach 18,000 to 24,000 containers. That puts it in the league of the largest container ships on the planet. Feel the difference? Galathea has real potential here. It could attract mega container ships even more actively than the port zones connected to the Panama Canal. That would genuinely reshape India's place in global trade and strengthen its position in its rivalry with China. Right now, a large share of global container trade moves through a handful of major transit hubs, especially Singapore and other Southeast Asian ports. These hubs function as transfer points. Large ocean-going ships arrive, cargo is transferred, and then containers move onward on regional routes. Galathea would add a major new hub right next to the main sea corridor between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Many companies could choose an Indian port instead, simply because unloading there may be more efficient. At first glance, this wouldn't concern China at all, but in reality, Beijing will hardly like it. China prefers a system it can fully control. When India is surrounded by Chinese investment and trade projects and can't do much. But this would create a new international trade hub capable of pulling cargo flows away from existing routes. That's something none of China's nearby projects has really achieved so far. So is this all about competing with China and reshaping regional trade? Not at all. India itself stands to gain a great deal. To begin with, every foreign cargo operation at Galathea would generate revenue for India. And given the scale of the port, there could be a lot of those operations, which means a lot of profit. On top of that, about 75% of Indian cargo is currently transshipped through other countries, including Singapore. So Delhi had a clear goal: build a port that would bring both the money and control over trade flows back home. Galathea looks fully capable of doing that. It all sounds impressive, but there's one important catch. Great Nicobar Island currently has a population of only about 9,000 people. There are just a couple of villages, and that's basically it. So who's supposed to work at this huge port? And can a massive port plus 2 villages really become a strategic point capable of changing the bigger picture? No. And India understands that, which is why the plan also includes turning the island into a magnet for new residents. India has set aside a vast stretch of coastal land for the project, about 64 square miles on the southern end of Great Nicobar. Essentially, it's a blank slate for a new world called Greenfield, where nearly everything still has to be built from scratch. And within that territory, 2 main hubs are already part of the plan. The first is the Campbell Bay area. Even now, it's the most alive part of the island. The idea is to turn it into the administrative and everyday core of the project. Housing, offices, shops, government functions, and services. This is where daily life is supposed to happen. As normal as life can be in a development of this scale. The second hub stretches toward Galathea, where the port's being built. The character there is entirely different. Less about living, more about working. Logistics, warehouses, ship servicing, energy, and heavy equipment. It's meant to be a place that runs around the clock without stopping. And between the two is not some empty no man's land, as you might expect, but a linking corridor, long and linear, carefully structured in advance. That's where functions are divided up section by section, where people will live, where they'll work, where green space will go, and where commercial activity will be concentrated. The goal is to prevent the kind of chaos that usually grows on its own. So the obvious question is any of this actually moving forward, or will it remain just another presentation filled with polished renderings? Judging by recent developments, the project is no longer just an idea. Indian authorities have already granted environmental clearances and approved the use of forest land for construction. At the same time, tenders are moving ahead for the port, roads, and core infrastructure. The population targets sound ambitious, to put it mildly. The first phase aims for about 150,000 residents by the 2030s to 2040. After that, the long-term plan is to scale up to 650,000 people by 2050. And how will people actually travel between the mainland and the island? Ships are one option, of course, but today most people clearly prefer flying. It's simply faster. India has taken that into account, so along with the urban districts and the port, Great Nicobar is also set to get an airport. It's being designed with future growth in mind from the very beginning. The runway is expected to be about 13,100 feet long. That puts it in a range many major airports don't even reach. In the future, its specifications are expected to meet 4E, 4F standards, meaning it should be able to handle the heaviest aircraft in commercial aviation. That includes double-deck Airbus A380s, the iconic Boeing 747, and long-haul workhorses like the Boeing 777 and Airbus A350, which naturally raises a simple question: why build such a large margin into the design? The answer lies in the scale of the vision. A runway like that would make it possible to operate direct flights from virtually anywhere in the world, without serious constraints tied to aircraft weight, range, or operational limits. Now to the passengers. In the first phase, the airport's expected to handle around 4 million passengers a year. That's already a substantial figure, but in reality, that's just the warm-up. The bigger expansion comes later. As the island's population grows and moves toward the 650,000 mark, capacity will be increased step by step. The logic is simple. If you're building a new hub, it has to breathe. People need to be able to arrive, leave, and move around without bottlenecks. And this brings us back to an important point. India believes China is encircling it not only economically, but militarily as well. So the obvious question is, can Delhi really answer that challenge with a city, an airport, and a port? In fact, India is building its own island version of Singapore in a way that can also support military operations. The deepwater port in Galathea Bay is officially presented as a civilian hub, but its technical specifications make it perfectly suited to host and service major naval strike groups, including aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines. That makes it much harder for Beijing to build up its presence in the region unnoticed. Any Chinese submarine leaving the South China Sea would enter the range of Indian sensors and patrols well before reaching the open Indian Ocean. Then there's the airport. From the early stages, it's being designed as a dual-use facility. The runway would be long enough to accommodate not just commercial aircraft, but military planes as well. Most importantly, that includes Su-30 MKI fighters and P-8I Poseidon patrol aircraft. And that means real control over both the sea and the air in the surrounding area. Building a city for hundreds of thousands of people is really about creating the rear base. Modern conflicts require enormous resources. Power plants, desalination facilities, hospitals, and repair infrastructure would all turn the island into a self-sufficient system, almost like a fortress. Now imagine the following scenario. The island sits about 745 miles from the Indian mainland. Waiting for supplies would be slow and risky, but here, everything would already be on site. Food, fuel, spare parts. The logistics loop could be closed locally. Would that be enough for complete control of the region? But even if it's not, India has other plans for the island as well. India has maintained a military base on Great Nicobar since 2012. It's the southernmost point of India's armed forces, officially described in Delhi as the country's Southern Sentinel. Until now, the base capabilities have been limited by its relatively short runway, just 4,300 feet long, which is mainly suitable for light patrol aircraft and helicopters. But under the new Indian project, the runway is expected to be extended, allowing it to handle more powerful and more dangerous aircraft. And now, just look at the map. Imagine how much India's military reach in the region could grow once this island mega project is completed. In a very short time, aircraft, helicopters, and warships could reach the Strait of Malacca if needed. The remaining question is, how do you monitor all of this? A surveillance system is essential. In fact, one's already in place. Coastal radars are already deployed across the Andaman Islands and the Northern Nicobar Islands. They continuously track nearby vessel traffic and provide a basic but important operational picture. On top of that, there are satellites, and then there's AIS, the system through which commercial ships transmit their coordinates, course, and speed. All of it's combined into a single unified map. So in the end, once the new project is completed, India will dramatically increase both its economic and military influence in the region. And at first glance, it may seem as though this project is India's only chance to push back against China's expansion, but that's not really the case. The scale is far bigger. Both countries are constantly taking new steps to expand their influence. Here's Iran. At first glance, it lies beyond Pakistan, a country India has constant tensions with. So how could it possibly matter in this geopolitical contest? China has the Gwadar port in Pakistan, a large and strategic hub we've already talked about. India's response will be located almost just across the sea, practically next door in maritime terms, and this is Chabahar port in Iran. The two are only about 106 miles apart. By ocean standards, that makes them almost neighbors. Indian engineers didn't build Chabahar from scratch, but in May 2024, India and Iran signed a 10-year agreement under which the Indian company IPGL took over the development and operation of one of the port's terminals. Why does that matter? While China was expanding its trade routes and reshaping Pakistan around its strategic needs, India was effectively stuck in a geographic dead end. Because of its long-running conflict with Pakistan, any overland route into Afghanistan and farther into Central Asia had been blocked for decades. Goods simply could not move through. Chabahar offers a way around that problem. Through this port, India gets a direct route toward Eurasian markets. Afghanistan and the resource-rich regions of Central Asia become more accessible. Not overnight, of course, but the corridor's there. And that's only part of the bigger picture. Gwadar and Chabahar are so close that, in strategic terms, they're almost within sight of one another. That gives Delhi a chance to keep a close eye on what its geopolitical rival's doing, and India's efforts don't stop there. The country's also trying to push deeper into Southeast Asia. There's such an organization, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. They trade with each other there, interact, and so on. For a long time, India was largely cut off from that space. It lacked a viable land route, while China was rapidly expanding its influence across the region. Then Delhi came up with an answer of its own. That answer is a trilateral highway stretching about 845 miles. It's meant to connect Mora in India with Mae Sot in Thailand through Myanmar. Essentially, it would become a land bridge between India and Southeast Asia. It sounds simple, but in fact, it would be a major strategic artery. Goods could move directly in a matter of days without relying on congested sea lanes or choke points like the Strait of Malacca. If the project is completed, it could eventually extend farther into Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. That would create an entire network tied not to China, but increasingly to India, an alternative economic corridor. But as usual, there are obstacles. Right now, the project looks more like a difficult puzzle with half the pieces still missing. India and Thailand are close to finishing their parts. Myanmar, however, remains the weak link. By 2026, several problems had piled up there at once. Domestic instability, and frankly, badly worn-out infrastructure, dozens of aging bridges, many dating back to the colonial era, need to be completely rebuilt. That is not a quick fix. Even so, India is not backing down. It continues to invest, complete key sections, and repair bridges, because without this road, all the talk about regional influence will remain just that, talk. If this corridor actually gets finished and projects like the ones underway in the Nicobar Islands start delivering results, Delhi may have a real chance to rebalance the situation and keep China from boxing it in on every side. Will it work? That remains an open question. But one thing's clear, the effort itself is clearly a serious one.